Glad that we can talk to Juan today. Juan is an old friend, colleague, electronic computer musician that I know since Canada, I guess. We met at the Banff Center. Great. And today we'd like to know about Juan's digital music background and his musicianship and overall how he creates and evaluates his music through computers. So Juan, can you tell us a little bit about your background as a musician? How did you come to work with computers?
Yeah, well, I was first a guitar player, so that's my origin as a musician, and I think that I always thought of the electronic media as a place where, in general, digital and analog, as a place where I had a way more, let's say, an aesthetic affinity with what I could do more so than guitar repertoire, if you will, or guitar music, or even the sound of the guitar itself. And so that was my first transition was into, well, how can I use electronics to modify the timbre of the guitar? And I think that there's a long tradition, so to speak, of electric guitarists that see the potential of pushing the boundaries of what can be done with effects and things like that into timbre manipulation. I guess that is part of the design of the instrument, of this system that is the guitar, the effects, and the amplifier on one end. And then when I moved to the Netherlands to study at the Institute of Sonology, two things happened. The first thing was that I overextended my stay tenfold than what was intended. I was supposed to be there for a year, and they made me an offer that I couldn't refuse, which was to start the bachelor's from scratch. And I was young enough that it didn't feel like a huge investment, or I didn't have a career that was on hold, or a family, or anything like that. And but that invitation came with a price to pay, which was that the invitation was also to kind of leave the guitar aside, or that's how I felt it, and focus solely in the electronic media. Now, this is kind of a fractal branch. So once I leave the guitar aside, then that means that the electronics are front and center in terms of sound generation, sound manipulation, and my source of frustration, which was how do I control these things expressively in front of an audience in real time? So how can I continue being a guitarist, basically? So that was the and of course in sonology back. I mean, it's been a long time since I haven't been there, but back when I was doing the program, I found a very interesting parallelism with my previous academic education, which was traditional composition at a Catholic university in Chile, which was going from, let's say, Gregorian chant into canons, into fugues, into maybe a piece for piano, and maybe a piece for piano and a melodic instrument, and then a quartet, and that was the structure. And in sonology, there was a similar structure in the sense that you had to go through studio techniques of the analog studio from the 50s and 60s, and then into understanding computer programming, like it was in the 70s and 80s, and then you moved on. So, in that respect, it was a very interesting reprogramming. And in that, of course, the role of the computer was very interesting because it didn't happen to me that I was just replacing things that you could do otherwise, which is what the computer is good at for a lot of people. Like, well, I need a tape recorder, I have a computer, or I need a synthesizer keyboard, I have a computer. But my first approach towards using a computer as an instrument was, oh, I need to learn how to program in Lisp in order to make masks, in order to control the analog studio, you know? So in that respect, I think that I had a very deep uh, transformation on in terms of what it meant to be a musician in time and off time with these digital tools. And of course, once once that part of, let's say, the educational part went over, I went back to say, okay, now I need to bring this back into the live performance. So and I think that that is where also started my area of fascination that shapes what I still am busy with today, which is this idea of reconstruction of early electronic systems for
Mm.
performances today, because it was a moment of integration of, oh, you have the computer, you can do things in real time now, but these things can also be informed by the shortcomings of the technology 10 years before, 20 years prior, 30 years prior. So
Mm.
that's how I think that that's kind of what led me and to my relationship with this instrument today. So I'm less of a let's say, I looked less into the computer as a way of emulating things that can be done otherwise, and I tried to find ways where the uniqueness of the object and its potentials can inform practices that happened before, and of course things that can be done today.
That's really interesting, Juan. And I know you've done quite a lot around reconstruction and readaptation of works, and we'll talk about it a lot more later. But I was also wondering, so does your kind of instrumental background did it inform the way that you interact with computers? And of course, you work with a lot of musicians too. So can you tell us a little bit about your current context of working, but also this instrumental influence?
Mm. I think it has changed over the years. I think at the beginning, yes, that this kind of the the focusing on what the computer could not do that a guitar could do was very much in the background of my work on how to make this computer as expressive as in a performance. Um, I and that is why I started a number of projects with different collaborators that and also asking people to write music for these projects where someone else, a composer, would have to look into the computer and say, well, let's design some constraints around it so you can play this piece. So this idea of practicing repeatability, let's say all the boring things of traditional performance practice that a
Mhm.
lot of let's say, instrumentalists wants to emancipate from. I was kind of coming from the other side, and I wanted to embrace those constraints in
Mhm.
order to help me define what things could be perceived and exploited as points of resistance on an abstract machine that doesn't really have those things, you know. And I'm not talking about. I know that there's a lot of nowadays. There's a lot of very interesting projects where the actual, I don't know, that you talk about the resistance of the computer as an instrument as really like how hard can you hit the key until it breaks and things like that. No, no, I was more thinking about this idea of you have an object that is created to have no identity, so to speak, and
Mm.
so how you compose an interesting musical identity with limits and all in order to expose those things in a performance situation. And uh, well, I cannot not talk about perhaps one of the most relevant projects, if not for anything else, for the duration that it had and the intensity of the work that I had together with percussionist Diego Espinosa and with another composer and electronic performer Henry Vega. We were a trio called the Electronic Hammer, and it was percussion and two computers. And it was always jokingly that it was like three percussionists, but two of them only had one finger. Like, so
Yeah.
in terms of also conventional musicianship, what you could do was, you know, read the music, do things on time, and then pass pages very quick and try to catch up. I mean, if you analyze what was being done performatively from a mechanical perspective, it was that, but it was more also about developing ways of listening, encouraging other composers to also question how they relate to technology. So, what happens if you ask someone to write a part that someone else can use? It changes the relationship with it, because then they start thinking of it as an instrument, and they start thinking about the limits of that instrument more so than what is the norm in a still today in a lot of computer hybrid pieces or performances, where chances are that the composer is the one performing the piece. That there's no need for systematization or explanation or notation of those parts, because you are the one who's going to be doing it. So I think that was an interesting dynamic, that also, of course, informed the things that I still do today, and it made me more hungry of trying to find those same challenges in pre-existing repertoire. Yeah.
Yeah, so in this article that you sent me, talk about the timbre networks. Is that kind of close to what you mean, kind of pushing others to reinterpret the computer works or computer music works rather of the same piece essentially, or is that
Yeah,
more towards
that is more.
geared
That
toward
is
one's performer? Yeah,
Yeah, I think
one
that
project.
the idea of the timbre networks was more, let's say, the same way that I was seeking for challenges that were coming from the world of traditional instrumentalists and how to adapt them into the computer media,
Mm,
including asking composers to notate parts and things like that.
mm,
I think that my idea as a composer of these timbre networks was to find common challenges that can be shared also with traditional instrumentalists. So it was more going in the opposite direction. Is to say to a percussionist or a flute player, think of your instrument not as what you do, but think of it as a system where you can disassociate sound production and physical actions, and try to find a way where the way you generate sounds and the way you approach that instrument is not necessarily the way you normally will do it. And the whole idea of the timbre networks was a way to kind of analyze and break down every incoming signal and action. So, if, for example, say you're playing the flute, uh, the intensity of blowing will be translated into triggering things in other instruments, for example, triggering dynamics somewhere else, or triggering pitch changes in a computer part, or starting and stopping pre-recorded sound files. So suddenly the things that you do as a performer have many and different consequences than the ones that you will normally do. So then you start thinking about airflow control as a flute player in a different way. And in a way that is closely connected to the idea of mapping a controller to play a digital instrument, which is the traditional practice that digital musicians need to go about. It's like, okay, I have these faders, I have these sliders, I have these buttons. What are they going to do in a performance, and what are the ranges and things like that? So I wanted to create something where those same questions and negotiations were extended to traditional instrumental practice. I
mm.
guess that's a way of putting it. Yeah.
Wow, I mean, I'm curious, how is that communicated live? Is it through some kind of a graphic, like animated score that's happening live for the performers?
No, not at all. That's more my, let's say, my fascination with the music and the ideas of Luigi Nono that creep in early on when I started defining what I wanted to do as a composer, or as a facilitator of collaborations with improvisers. And it got really quickly into a place where notation if it was present, it was kind of a necessary pragmatic consequence because there was a commission or there was a project that needed certain duration or a certain instrumentation and you needed to divide the materials. But the way the tempo networks in themselves occur are more a composition of relationships. So let's say again, let's take the case of the flute player. Is that well, you have to learn that there are 3 or 4 things that you do that are derived from your natural actions as a flute player that have certain consequences, and those consequences, for the most part, remain consistent. As in, well, when you blow, the intensity of the blow triggers this or that, and that is that. And then everything else that it happens in the performance is a negotiation done by listening.
Mm,
uh, and more, let's say, the more complicated the timbre network I created, the less I myself as a performer was involved in the generation of sound. But what I was doing in performance was remapping the relationships between the other actors and their actions and the consequences of those actions.
mm,
To, uh, and that is why I'm pretty sure that is why, uh, let's say, those who came again, let's say that basically that collaborated with me more than once, is because they were improvisers and they were enjoying the fact of having an external agent reshaping their relationship with their instrument continuously. So then these performances for me, as the actions that I was doing, became really kind of a game of confusing the performers. So the moment that they felt confident, that they knew that they could hear the relationship between their actions and what was being produced and heard, and they felt that they have a certain degree of control,
mm,
then the network shifted, and then suddenly what they were doing had an effect somewhere else, and maybe very subdued. So it was always about inviting people to keep the attention, their primary feedback on what they were doing in their ears, and not necessarily in
mm,
the mouth or the hands, which is something that is
mm,
very, very late Luigi Nono, as so to say. I mean, in this idea of using your ears as your primary feedback to not only shape what you're doing, but also to keep the attention and the tension on what is happening, uh, and which is very much a reaction, at least from my part, uh, from doing a lot of concerts as the computer performer of written pieces, where the score in front of you is a score for the flute player, the guitarist, the violinist, and the electronics part is just boxes with numbers, and you have to read through and press next, 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 and that's it. Uh, that's all you have as expressiveness on
mm,
one end. uh, and I think that it also has to do with, maybe for the traditional performer, and correct me if I'm wrong, the same is true, as in a lot of those pieces, uh, you go on a stage, you study your part, you don't really care about the electronics, and you have a stopwatch, and you start the piece, and you go, you know,
mm,
and listening to what the electronics are doing ends up being optional. Uh, so in so that is something that I saw as the norm of, let's say, professional academic circuits
mm,
for pieces for instruments and electronics, and that was not what I wanted to be part of. So
mm. So it was
yeah,
kind of a little bit of a reaction against that
yeah, yeah,
mode of working.
yeah.
Cool. And yeah, I'm wondering actually, so Timbre Networks, because the project I work for is digital score project. Would you
Hmm.
consider this to be like a digital oral kind of score for performers?
Absolutely, absolutely. Maybe
Mm,
not in the sense of more from a metaphorical sense on what a score means. The score as an archive, the score as a space of potential for new things to happen. No,
Mm-hmm.
the not necessarily the score um, as a prescriptive set of instructions of what to do,
Mm-hmm.
but more as a condensation of things that have happened, uh, that in turn can become a new iteration of the same thing, or a new thing that is connected to
Mm-hmm.
it. And that's how they work. I mean, they work uh, whenever there are occasions where I do these performances and then something special happens and we all identify it as such, then I make sure that that is distilled and stored somehow inside of the network.
Mm.
So I did a series of performances in Japan 10 years, 12 years ago with a dancer. And then I had the opportunity to work with her a couple of times later on. But since then, I have a little video of the dancer performing inside of the network and a little tracker that basically does what it did in that performance, which was following the edges. It was pre-COVID, but kind of COVID technology in terms, if you think of the
Oh,
aesthetics
yes.
of these performances. So basically, she
Was
was
like long distance
yeah,
performance.
long distance, but
Telematic. Yeah.
also like with her phone, like
Oh,
with what
right.
you had
Yeah.
at hand, not
Mm.
not in a studio or anything like that.
Mm.
So she was projecting herself from the studio in her mobile phone. So basically, what I decided to do is that screen were the limits, so she used it as walls. So you really use the edges of the screen to
Mm-hmm.
act as if those were the physical walls of the space where she was at. And then what I did is basically I tracked the negative spaces, so the background. So whenever she will cover certain areas or in the space, that will trigger certain events. And I still use that. I still
Mm-hmm.
use with a little tracker inside, and that is used for spatialization of certain parameters. And like that, there are other, let's say, more traditional musical things like gestures from going from. There's one collaboration with a bassoon player that I still use, which is basically a long sequence of her listening to this very early electronic music gesture in Contact and in other pieces of
Mm.
going with a pulse generator from pulses into a timbre very gradually. And I asked
Mm.
her to reproduce that with the bassoon. So basically going from back, 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 and
Mm.
go as
Mm.
gradually as possible into one tone.
Mm.
And that is used as control information in the timbre network also for years and years. So there are little
Mm.
residuals of the previous
Mm.
performances that have made certain aspects of what is coming out, if not repeatable, at least relatable.
Mm.
Yeah.
So in a way, the computer, your network is learning from live performances from
Yeah,
real humans how to
exactly.
be more
But
human,
not in an
maybe.
AA kind of way, but more like taking aspects of their
Okay, yeah,
personality
that was actually a little my
yeah,
little follow-up,
yeah.
because it seems like now a lot of this stuff would be automatically used for AI kind of control of machine learning of these gestures and musical gestures. Is that something that the network
No,
would
no,
include in the future, or?
no, not at all. I think that in that the network is lo-fi and precarious and fragile, almost by design, and I like it that way. And I have a deep respect for people who actually know what they're doing when it comes to machine learning and applying it for
Hmm.
music. My and with the duo with Jonathan Impet, Three States of Wax, we do use Dicey 2, and we modified it a bit so we can load multiple buffers, and learn from what we're playing, because we're trying to tap into that world in a dynamic way.
Mhm.
I think that my biggest hesitation, or not hesitation, but my distance aesthetically speaking from that world
Mhm.
for myself is that it is designed to work best on large data sets.
Mm.
As in, and I know the work of Marek and Roberto Trillo, and I will email you the proper names and references later if you want to use them.
Oh yeah,
But
I know of Roberto
you
Trio,
know
but
them, no?
Marek.
Marek, Roberto and Marek, they collaborate for many
Okay.
years. So
Mm.
Roberto is the violin player, no, and he's in Hong Kong, I think, and Marek, I think he's in the States somewhere.
Mm.
But they have this idea of okay, a learning
Mhm.
from the violin, like an accumulation of hours and hours and hours and hours of gestures until something clicks and something new starts appearing, no? uh, and especially if you want to compare that, which is the normal approach of AI, like how to find interesting things in large data sets, interesting enough that feels fresh and new. I am almost in the opposite corner, as in what I try
Mhm.
is to capture the one thing that happened at that one single moment and preserve it and
Mhm.
use it, recycle it inside of a system, no? But
Mm.
I'm not. My feeling is that I don't have that much to say that it will become interesting for the AI to find something.
Hmm.
I can find.
Well,
I can.
you
I
say
can.
that, but I'm sure you do.
No, no, but yeah, but I mean, in terms of the dimensions where AI models seem to start working in a way that captures one's imagination again, that feedback seems to
Mm.
happen after a long time
Mhm.
or a large amount of things. And for me, if I didn't hear something interesting in the moment, I have a hard time thinking that it will be interesting
Mm.
just by accumulation.
Mm.
Mm.
Great. And so as I understand, you work mostly with improvisers at this point, but also musicians who are open to this kind, well, musicians who do both, like are contemporary
Mm.
music
Mm.
performers. But also I saw this work you did for theater, and I think it also featured musicians in
Mm.
reconstructing a work of Bruno Maderna.
Mm. Mm.
And that was really interesting. And I was wondering, what was your approach, your process in making that work? Yeah.
Yeah, that particular work, Hyperion, it was kind of a multi-layer process. It was an invitation from a theater group, actually, where they were the ones with the idea, and it was to make, let's say, a pocket version of Hyperion, which is a piece by Maderna for soprano, flute, and orchestra, and
Mm.
choir. Uh, the interesting thing is that um, this group, the theater group, is called Muta Imago. They came with the proposal of, for them, what was revolutionary was to use the duration of a musical piece as the time structure to develop a dramaturgy. Uh, so then they say, well, if we're going to replace elements, then they have to be replaced by things that last the same amount of time. So if you were to put the recording of the version that they picked uh, of Hyperion side by side with their proposal, then it should last the same and the sections should be the same. And I mean, it was an interesting project, and of course there was a lot of this idea of that is very common in theater, and musicians are very scared of, which is this idea of adapting things, no, keeping them
Mhm.
fresh. So I think that music, and certainly classical music, even let's say for me, Kaya Sariajo's operas are classical music. Let's say that world
Mm.
is very afraid of transforming the work,
Yeah, of being
and
imprecise or something.
exactly, and theater is everything but,
Mm. Mhm.
and
Mhm.
maybe from a different perspective, theater is more conservative, and but when it comes to understanding what is the respect to the work, I think that musicians are the worst in terms of
Yeah.
conservatism, no, that
Yeah.
um, So in that perspective, working with a theater group, it was okay. Now there's an open field to work with these materials
Mhm.
in the context of a piece of music that itself was modular. So that maybe that's why it was tolerated more in the sense that this piece by Maderna, uh, to my understanding, I think that every time that it was performed while he was alive, it had he had rearranged, cut things, put a different section, add things. So it also was an invitation to dig deeper in the history of the whole work to take references. So in my particular case, the challenge was multiple, but it was basically to use orchestral recordings of Maderna conducting uh, for certain sections of the whole show that needed the orchestral sound and use, let's say, multi-channels to move the orchestral groups around and create kind of duets of recorded orchestras with the actor, because there was an actor doing reciting and dancing and drawing. And the other thing was to take very short electronic music experiments that Maderna did at the Studio of Fonologia in Milan that were used only for one performance of this work, and try to reproduce them, recreate them, and expand them and add them in during the show for transitions, for certain moments where as much as they wanted to be precise, when it comes to theater, there's still things that need to fall into place, as in, well, when the dancer is jumping, then there's a fake moon that is coming down, and when it hits the ground, then you need to go to the next thing. And sometimes there's a give or take 10 seconds, which goes against the grid of having a very precise timeline. So for those moments where things needed to be extended or sped up, then I had this additional instrument that was based on the sounds that Maderna composed, but only used for one performance. So that was one thing, and that was a theater work. And then what happened is that when the performances were done, we were supposed to have a good video recording from the RAI, because and that never manifested itself. Let's say I had the audio, but the video never happened.
Mm.
So then I was like, well, then maybe I'll go and do the next step, and that's my personal project, was uh, to further transform this work. Now, not anymore for the stage, so I did without all the visual aspects of it and all the texts and all the, let's say, incidental music for to move a theater performance, and replace them with music. So I gave more emphasis to the electronic part. I took out all the orchestral recordings of Maderna and left only electronics in place. I extended the flute and soprano parts, so they have a bigger presence than in the show. And I decided to release it only on vinyl, because the whole idea of Hyperion, or parts of the idea of the work, had to do with this conflict of the man, or the protagonist, with a decaying world around him. So I wanted to present it in a format that would decay over time.
Mm.
And I asked um, Taylor Dupré to master it for me, and we went back and forth a couple of times, but he understood it very quickly, that I needed a mastering of the work that was already on the edge of fragility. So on the softest passages of the album, you can already barely hear the voice. So
Oh.
if you play it twice or three
Mm.
times, then the surface noise of the vinyl will actually cover
Oh,
parts of
wow.
the work. And so
Okay.
you don't need to put it in the
Mm.
sun, or only you play it a couple of times, you'll really start hearing that the noise of the material is creeping in and is replacing aspects of the music.
Mm,
that, and I also used like locked loop groups at the end of each side to have this idea of things that don't end. And so
mm,
I try to use the actual material, the
mm,
vinyl, the format, as something that was in connection with the ideas behind the music and behind the work of Maderna.
mm,
And that led me to develop this idea of opaque technologies. So this idea of how the technologies that we use in making music, digital or otherwise, are everything but transparent. And transparency seems to be the idealistic feature of these tools that surround us from a commercial perspective, no? Like the
mm,
these things are here to reduce the friction between you and the world. And for me, I mean, for the things that we've been talking, I guess it's obvious. For me, if anything, I've been trying to impose and exacerbate the frictions because that
mm,
was the resistance of the guitar that I was looking for
mhm,
since I replaced it with digital technology. So that project and the things that I started working on later focused more and more on this idea of the exposition of the lack of transparency of technology and how that can be turned into an aesthetic object, a color, a sound.
mm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, just the whole process of what you mentioned, it almost seems like you were forcibly trying to make it retro and seem like it was originally Moderna. But meanwhile, it was working with these ideas of fragility and opaqueness of technology to create a new uh, a piece of work made now,
Mm,
reappropriated, of course,
mm.
in a ways. Uh, yeah, am I correct in thinking this way?
Yeah, it's not only the age thing. I mean, the things that I do now also deal with the network technology and the shortcomings of that technology today, and I exacerbate those things and present them as this is the sound of the internet, you know?
Mm,
So so it's not necessarily an age thing. Of course, age plays a role because when we think fondly or positively about technological shortcomings, it comes from a place of nostalgia. So it's like, ah, the hiss of the tape,
mm,
or I don't know, things like that. You know, like it, and those are things that even as creative musicians, sometimes we want to latch on because it is a sonic way of connecting our who we are now with a tradition and a past, and to a certain extent uh, consciously or unconsciously, also that is a way of validating what we do today. No,
mm,
like oh, we come from this. It's like
mm,
when people very loosely, anyone that use sampling started saying, no, no, I do musique concrète and Pierre Schaeffer without ever even listening to a piece by him. You know, like so there's a danger there,
mm,
but I do think that potential friction and the potential creative outcome that comes from any friction is there in any piece of technology, like speakers, microphones. Those these things are everything but transparent.
mhm,
The thing is that you're only reminded about the lack of transparency when these things don't work as they should.
mhm,
No?
mhm,
Uh, but when they work as they should, they're still coloring the
mhm,
signal. They're still adding. There are still filters, and as much as we want to work past that, I think that my personal fascination with using digital technologies or any kind of technology is in reminding us that these things are contributing to the voice and to the experience. You
mhm,
know, so
mhm,
yeah, there is an age, and there's and of course, uh, if I focus in pieces from the 50s and 60s, is because I am looking to, this is where the
mhm,
first time a composer grabbed a filter that had this clickety thing, and why is a third of an octave and or jumping by octaves, and in how many pieces do you hear that filter played like that, and where does it come from? It has nothing to do with music, like those things. those are my fascinations, of course,
Mm,
but also current stuff. Also, the current internet technologies are very fascinating for me, when how they circumvent things, so they pretend to act as if they're not there, but of course latency is an issue, compression is an issue. They're they're
mm,
unavoidable things,
mm,
that's part of how technology works. Is it chooses a slice that
mm,
kind of works and focuses only on that, and pushes aside everything else. And I
mm,
try to find ways of moving the focus back on those liminal
mm,
moments where the asides that have been pushed uh, creep in again.
mm.
Mm.
Wow, that's really fascinating. And I'm just wondering, so this opaqueness actually, it seems to me like it opens door to imagination, reimagination. So like not knowing exactly how did that microphone and Nono's, piece from the 60s work exactly opens your imagination to recreate something different today, for the performer. So is that part of your fascination with reconstructing works? Is that it's kind of imaginative and creative for you?
Yes, I mean there are two things there. I think that, of course, it's like free composition lessons. No, like when you start going deep into systems that were used in the past, and the shortcomings of those systems, and how they worked around those things, or how they embraced them and they became part of the works that we know now, uh, is a way of coming from the score, or it's not coming from the polished history that is being told afterwards, like, oh, I had this idea and then this is the piece. No, I think that when there's technology mediating the creative process, there's always a negotiation. No,
Mm,
and how to embrace that is very important. So from a creative perspective, yes, that is very much there, um, but also from a more, let's say, from a sustainability point of view, I
mhm,
think to that understanding how the technology of the past worked, and rather than dismissing it for its shortcomings and say, well, I'm going to make a new version of this piece for instrument and tape delay that was done in the 70s. And of course, I'll use Max or my phone or a pedal or whatever that is, because it's super easy to do. Of course, that is a way of dealing with it, but a, I don't want to sound too critical, but there is a missed opportunity in not understanding that perhaps what makes relevant that work today is not in how it functioned, but in the frictions that it had to negotiate in performance. So, if anything, a piece like that should be translated into the technology of with the shortcomings, with the problems, or update the problems to problems that we have today. So, one of the examples that I put very often, and I don't know if I sent it to you, was my adaptation of Stockhausen's solo, because that is a piece that is very easily done with the technology of today. It's for a melodic instrument and a tape delay system. And of
mm,
course, back in the day, it was one of the first instantiations of a piece using a tape delay loop system live, which means that they had to build a machine and they had to calibrate the machine and set it up on a performance
mm.
space,
Yes.
and people, audiences were drawn to see this thing,
Yeah.
and the frustrations of the technicians had to do with how fragile it was and how wobbly the tape got, and like all those things. So to make an iPhone app that says, oh, now you can play solo
Mm,
or your phone.
mm,
Yes, it's been done, and I think that is a wonderful tool for musicians to practice the piece. But it does nothing to extend the creative potential of this work in performance in front of an audience, you know.
Mm,
And I think that we have to be wary of that. We have to be mindful of that. So you need to find other ways in to this
mhm,
particular work and understand. And in my case, one of the things that I did was that if you hear the first recording of the piece for Deutsche Grammophon in the 60s, there's a section that I know well that where the piece is supposed to have kind of a accumulation of density,
mhm,
and because all of it's been recording for a while and it's the
mm,
trombone player, and so my hypothesis is that what Stockhausen wanted to do was to create additive synthesis like he was doing in the studio with sine waves, you know, that
mm.
you play a sine wave, you
Yeah,
record it, you play it
like
back,
manual. Yeah.
exactly, and then you create a chord, no?
Mm,
Or a timbre, a new
mm,
timbre. I think that was searching for timbre richness. And when you put and I always thought like this is weird because with a rich instrument you get distortion. You don't get that. And of course, when that part comes, what you hear in the recording is all these pieces of tape, of hymnen, Kurzweil, electronic sounds, voices. So he solved it by adding stuff, that
mm,
had nothing to do with the system of that
mm,
or what could be done with the tape delays. So what I did is say, well, if he did it for to solve this technical problem,
mhm,
then what we can do today is what he couldn't do then, which is do the same live. And that's when I made a version with like multiple performers, different instrumentalists, but all remote except but one on in the concert hall. And then these people are playing, they're all coordinated, but you don't hear them. You only hear them in those moments. And that is something that is a very, let's say, a very basic feature of network performance. That
mm.
is, you are in the now, but you are disassociated from the physical space where the performance is taking place.
Yeah, almost
So
disembodied, you could say.
yeah, yeah. So, and of course, people were kind of freaking out, like the audience, and they thought that there was a technical problem because they saw all these people playing, but they couldn't hear them. And I'm
Mm,
like, well, no.
mm,
But of course, then that's my personal kind of, let's say, artistic research dissemination problem, which is okay. Do I explain before that? Don't worry, this is a feature, not a bug, or, or I let it be, and
mm.
I experience what they experience and see what they take out of it.
Mm.
So, but that's
Uh,
an example.
so that's kind of your way of creatively reinterpreting that work, which led you to other solutions. Great. So I'm wondering, do you have anything else to add to the conversation we're having? Any uh latest projects you're working on?
Yeah, I think that well, I'm going further deep in the rabbit hole of this idea of I don't know what to call them. There are many labels for the things that I do, like radical interpretations or experimental for performances, or some people will say, well, latching on the reputation of someone else. But I am fascinated by this idea of reconstruction of early works,
Mm,
and my current let's say the current projects that I'm working on have to do with going into works that were developed in the studios, so
mm,
tape pieces from the 50s and 60s, and extract the how you call it the inherent performative actions that some of those pieces had,
mm-hmm,
and bring those into the live or inform a live version of those.
mm-hmm,
The first project that I did like that, and that I'm should be finished an article now-ish
mm-hmm,
about it, is taking a work by Eliane Radig,
mm,
an early feedback piece. So it was
mm-hmm,
done for tape and using feedback sounds like microphones on speakers, But what I did is to make an analysis of that work and breaking it down and understand it, and then is what I call interpretation as time machine. So when you start doing an experimental performance, you also have the opportunity to take not only the piece but also the composer and their practice over the years. And in the case of Eliane Radic, there's if you want to be dogmatic about her work production, you have a first stage, which are these early feedback pieces that have only been discovered or recovered lately. Then you have a long time period of her uh, musical production that was done with the ARP 2500. So she had one of these big synthesizers, and
Mm,
that was how she made her music. And then very late in her life, she started working with performers and making this kind of guided, collaborative solo or ensemble pieces.
mm,
And for me, it was like, well, what happens if I take all of this and through one of her early works, I
mm,
create a piece that is live,
mm,
that uses the sounds of the ARP 2500,
mm,
that uses the textures and organizations of her uh, early feedback pieces, but when in performance follows the guidelines and the performative, um, let's say, salience that her instrumental works have.
mm,
So that's one thing that I've done, and I'm working on other examples, but they're still
mm.
cooking. So yeah,
Yeah, that's fascinating. Of course, when you have a computer, you can really reimagine that world as you
yeah,
are doing.
yeah.
Uh, and are you at all in contact with her? Is she aware of
No,
these?
I was part of of a conference that was done in her honor, but she was ill at the
Mm,
time. Uh, but I have interviewed and worked at a lot of performers that had worked with her,
mm,
mainly because what I was interested was more of a technical thing. I was not, I'm not really interested in making this kind of a sanctioned performance or anything like that. I think that it really is because I come from uh, an an approach towards performance and interpretation that is very creative and very personal. It's my creative outlet.
mm,
Um I am very aware of the texts, of the music, of the methodologies. I interview people. I'm very rigorous when it comes to those things,
mm,
but I don't necessarily, at that point, I don't think that her opinion of what I
mm,
do with a piece that she did
mm,
50 years ago
mm,
will change my approach.
mm. Yeah. Actually, I've heard that sometimes she doesn't even remember works that are that old in her catalog. She'll say like, I don't actually remember what happened. Here's the
Well,
drawing. Uh,
the thing is that some of these works, let's say, were very site specific and time specific,
mm,
and if we know them today, it's because of the an act of love of others, no,
mm-hmm,
that saw a potential, they
mm-hmm,
put it in a release, but sometimes those releases are also a creative rendering of these people that put them together,
mm-hmm,
because a piece that is made with three reel-to-reel tapes that are supposed to be playing in a loop at different speeds. The only way
mm-hmm,
to reproduce that is having three reel-to-reel tapes with the recordings playing in a loop, which I have done. I mean, as part of the
mm-hmm,
exercise, I done it and I presented the work as such.
mm-hmm,
But then if you buy a vinyl with like a 15-minute excerpt of one version of that, then what is that? I mean, how is that more faithful to the work, so to speak,
mm-hmm,
than anything else, you know?
mm-hmm,
So I think that those are the things that I find fascinating when people start
mm-hmm,
touching in this cult of personality, especially with composers that are still alive, no? But it's the same in the circle around Stockhausen and the circle around Nono. I mean, there's a point where as a creative music practitioner, you need to be extremely respectful of the things that you care about and how you're going to present them and how but unless you think you can build a career as being a, I don't know, an acolyte of someone, then you just focus on your own work,
Hmm.
even if it's through the works of others. That is, but it's still your own.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, because we've been talking so much about computer music, just brief, is it possible to describe your setup
Oh,
briefly, or is it always depends on the work, of course, the people you're playing with? But what is
it's
your core setup?
it's very malleable. It's very malleable. But we can go. I'll tell you the constants, and then I'll move back.
Mm,
So when it comes to software, I use Macs.
mm,
And I use Macs for nearly everything I do. I have delved into many other things like Super Collider and the Composer desktop project and things like that. But Macs is, let's say, for good or bad, is where I operate and where I live. So if there is a new project that requires a sketch of a tool or things like that, then I'll always start with it. I have only used things more popular like Ableton Live by commission, as in someone wrote a piece in Ableton that I have to play.
mm,
Then then I install it in the computer, make sure that it works, map the MIDI controller, and I go with it. But if not, it's Max. And then in terms of controllers, I have an array. I build my own. I have some specialization oriented controllers with gyroscopes and
mm,
distance sensors and things like that. And they're very fragile. They're prototypes that have survived 20 years, but then so
mm,
I have not seen the. And then I use these little Korg nano controllers, nano sliders.
mm.
I have way too many of them.
Yeah,
Not
me
because they
too.
break, but it's just because they're
Mm,
inexpensive, they're
mm,
reliable. They're a bit annoying. I mean, you have to know how to map them to make sense in a performance. I mean,
mm,
I will never control dynamics with those little sliders, you know? I mean,
mm,
I tend to map them as on or off and
mm,
just push them like that. Then I am OS agnostic, so I have computers
mm,
in Linux, Windows, and Mac. And from time to time, I try to check the patches from the last 2 years and make sure that they still work in Windows and Mac, just in case something comes along and I need to, for the peripherals or whatever, I need to use one or the other. I don't want to spend the
mm,
2 days before a performance finding out that, oh, this external expired five
mm.
years ago and
Yeah,
and
of
and I
course.
cannot be used. So I try to do that progressively. I have to say that I'm very lazy with my own pieces, so I keep around very old computers just so those things survive.
Mm,
And then I do use occasionally iOS things, iPads, mostly as MIDI controllers using Touch OSC,
mm.
which is a, well,
Yeah.
OS, yeah. I never know if Touch OSC is really OSC. It uses the OSC protocol, but in terms of actual resolution, I think that is more like a MIDI controller. But you can, but you can create your own maps and your own
Mm,
things. So I guess that the workflow, if it's a new, not a personal project, but like a new assignments, I start creating a sketch in Max of how the things will work out. Then I try to create a custom controller in TouchOSC to have access to all the things that need to be done in performance. And then I start thinking with it.
mm,
And so that's that methodology. Now,
mm,
for the duo with Jonathan Impet, the three states of wax that I didn't talk about a lot about, is because it is he is the one carrying the laptop, so all the DICE2 programming is done in Max in his machine, And I actually carry a modular system. It's a small
Mm-hmm.
modular that has one module that where I can load PD patches. So I make PD patches and then store them in that module. And then I use that's the digital component of the otherwise analog
Mm.
environment.
Mm.
Um, and in that, I also recently started using the iPad
Mm.
for two pieces of software that are really great. And of course, the name will escape me. If you want to keep them on record, I'll search for them now. One is called Gauss, and the other one is called Bliss, I think. I
Mm.
believe that they're from the same lab,
Mm.
and they're basically a looper and a long delay system. But what I
Mm.
found interesting and why I started using those uh, was that they have a function where you can allow the repetitions of the loop to degrade over time.
Mm.
So with every repetition, it's not tape-like, it's not tape emulation, but it emulates like the sampling degrade of old, let's say early 90s, late 80s digital delays.
Mm.
So if you let it run for long enough, then you only get digital garbage, basically, which I find fascinating, of course. So I use it for some things. I think I've used it in the past for a piece that we do by Fred Revsky,
Mm.
uh, where you have to perform over the course of uh, half an hour.
Mm.
So I just leave that in the background and I only open it up at the end. So when
Mm.
the thing is almost garbage, only garbage.
Wow.
And what else? Well, in terms of digital things, of course, the I do a lot of things that are over the internet,
Mm.
and for that, if things need to be clean and it's about playing together with others and we're all in different locations, uh, I use Jacktrip, of course, as the
Mm.
audio, and then we use Jitsi as the video.
Mm.
Uh, the video is more of a reference. We don't care too much about the video quality, and I think that the setup is that we play over Jacktrip, uh, we see each other and project ourselves over Jitsi, but then those things get sent to OBS, the
Mm.
Open Broadcasting, and then
Mm.
that goes into a Vimeo channel, and by
Mm.
then the liveness is is like 20 seconds, 30 seconds later. So, but the audience doesn't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm.
It's like the Oscars safety, no, against censorship safety. You know, that the DA also the broadcast in case
Yeah.
someone does something wrong. And then for one of my internet pieces where I need more real-time control over the settings because I'm dynamically changing the sample rate and the quality of the codec and things like that, then I use Sonobus because it allows me to load a connection as a plugin in a DAW. And my DLW of choice is Digital Performer because I've been using. That's how I learned. I learned Audiodesk, and then I moved to Digital Performer, and I know how to use all the others like Logic, Pro Tools, and all this,
Mm.
but I'm
Yeah.
lazy. And
Aren't we all? No, sometimes.
yeah,
The
yeah.
the tools you learn first somehow always stay with
That's
you.
yeah, yeah. You stick to what you know, and I do, and I do have a lot of modular scenes and Euro racks and all, and my more recent, let's say, work, how you call it, work justified fascination, of course, is to compare a lot of these analog filters and generators with the real deal. So I do have I
Mm.
don't know if you can see. Maybe I can
I
move
can sort of see things in the back.
here in
Yeah,
the
the Euro
back.
track. Yeah.
But the Euro
Nice.
rack is there. But then here in the back, I do have a lot of test equipment,
Mm.
which is the like, kind of the original tools that were not meant to make music.
Mm.
Uh, and I think that if I read and I want to create things that describe
Mm.
these processes of appropriation of
Mm.
non-musical tools to make music, it was important to actually
Have the real
have the
thing.
experience, know
Yeah.
how they work.
Mm.
Uh, be fascinated about 60 years old equipment that works, and meanwhile the nano controllers you have to, they're not disposable but almost.
Yeah,
So
recycle.
yeah, exactly.
If it stops working.
Yeah,
Great, Juan. Well, actually, we could talk forever. It's really
yeah,
fascinating. And it's so great to hear about your practice and what you've been up to lately. And please do let me know about the Elian Ready piece. Sounds fascinating when it's finished.
yeah. I think it will
Uh,
be in Tempo. The text will be available
oh,
in
great.
Tempo. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But the work is it already like done?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
yeah.
I will send you. I will
Oh,
send it
okay.
to you. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And any other references you'd like, you can
Okay.
send me so I could maybe include them. Great. So yeah, thank you very much again. And yeah, all the best with other work.